I'm wearing my work clothes today. I've got my cobbler's hammer. A cobbler is the same thing as a shoemaker, and I'm trying to fix these shoes, but it reminds me of a story I heard a long time ago about a shoemaker and his friends, the elves. So I'm going to tell you that story now. Once upon a time, a shoemaker lived with his wife above his workshop. The shoemaker was a good man, and he worked hard, and he was very poor. The day came when he only had enough leather to make one more pair of shoes. He cut out the leather, and then he left them on his workbench. And he was just so tired, he said, I will be able to make a better pair of shoes tomorrow after I've had a good night's sleep. And so he and his wife went upstairs. The next morning, the shoemaker went back downstairs, and what a surprise he had. Instead of the leather on his workbench, there were a brand new pair of shoes. They were neatly and perfectly made with not a stitch out of place. These shoes are masterpieces, the shoemaker exclaimed to his wife. He put them in the window, hoping someone would come and see them and buy them. Soon a finely dressed young man entered the workshop, and he wanted to try on the shoes. They fit perfectly. The man was so pleased, he happily paid a high price. The shoemaker was able to buy enough leather to make 2 more pairs of shoes. And that night the shoemaker was tired, but he cut out the leather and he left it on his workbench, and he went up to bed. The next morning, the shoemaker had another surprise. There on the workbench were 2 new pairs of shoes. They were even more beautiful than the first pair, and they were just as perfectly made. Before lunchtime, the shoemaker had sold both pairs for a very good price. Now he had enough money to buy shoe leather for 4 pairs of shoes. Once again, he cut out the leather, left it on his workbench, and he went upstairs to bed. In the morning, they found 4 pairs of shoes, all perfectly stitched. And the same thing happened every day for weeks. The shoes appeared as if by magic. Let's try and find out who's making them. So that night, the shoemaker left some leather on his workbench, just as always, and then instead of going to bed, he and his wife hid behind a curtain at the back of the shop. There they waited, and they waited, and they waited, and finally, at the stroke of midnight, in danced 2 tiny elves through the door. They skipped up to the workbench and quickly began to sew the leather into new shoes. As they worked, they sang, "We will sew and we will stitch to help the shoemaker grow rich." Soon the shoes were finished, and the little elves danced out of the shop. "We must repay our little helpers for their kindness," the shoemaker told his wife. "Let's make them some clothes," she said. So the next day, the shoemaker's wife knitted 2 cozy woolen jackets, 2 tiny scarves, and 2 pairs of warm pants. The shoemaker used his finest leather to make 2 little pairs of boots. And that night, instead of leaving leather on the workbench, the shoemaker left the clothes all wrapped up in shiny paper and ribbons, and then he and his wife hid behind the curtain to wait. At the stroke of midnight, the shop door opened, and in came the little elves. They hopped up onto the workbench and saw the presents that had been left for them, and the elves opened the presents at once. And in the twinkling of an eye, they had dressed in their new clothes. The presents were the shoemaker's way of saying thank you. The elves did a happy dance singing, "Now the shoemaker's grown rich, there's no need to sew and stitch." Then they hopped off the workbench and scurried out the door, and the shoemaker and his wife never saw the little elves again. But their troubles were all over, and they had a good and happy life together for many long years.